My name is Mohamed Elmaazi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Truth Defense. Truth Defense exists to confront attacks on progressive political voices, whistleblowers, journalists, and truth-tellers of all kinds, which have become increasingly prevalent in societies which identify as democratic, including the UK. Examples of recent articles which can be found at truthdefense.org include a review of the Open Rights Group's scathing report of the failures of the UK data watchdog over the government and private sector's handling of confidential NHS medical data during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also since then. The National Security Bill currently being pushed through the UK Parliament is another item which has been covered by Truth Defense. The National Security Bill essentially risks obliterating journalism as we know it, along with the right to seek out and receive information. And then finally, my review of the documentary about Julian Assange's struggle for freedom, Ithaca, a link to which can be found within the article itself. Joining me today is Kit Klarenberg. Kit is an investigative journalist exploring the role of intelligence services in shaping politics and perceptions. He has published for numerous outlets, including the Grayzone, Mint Press News, and the Electronic Intifada, among many others. On the 18th of May, when entering the UK from abroad, Kit was stopped by counter-terrorism police and asked about his work for the Grayzone. Upon exiting the plane at Luton Airport, Kit was issued a notice of detention under Schedule 3 to the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act 2019, and he was interrogated for a number of hours. Kit was threatened with arrest if he failed to answer any question put to him, or if he failed to hand over his bank cards and SIM cards, and if he failed to provide the PINs and passwords to all of his electronic equipment, including his laptop and his smartphone, which were also temporarily confiscated from him. The National Union of Journalists issued a statement on the 2nd of June expressing grave concern over Kit being detained under counter-terrorism legislation. In the NUJ statement, Seamus Dooley, the NUJ Assistant General Secretary, was quoted as saying that, quote, "The detention of Kit Klarenberg and line of questioning pursued by officers is of huge concern to the NUJ. Journalists have the right to protect sources Journalists have the right to protect sources, and the seizure of Kit's personal material in this manner under counterterrorism law leaves many questions unanswered. The apparent targeting of a journalist risks creating a chilling effect on others reporting on stories in the public interest, and many will be aware that it follows the recent arrest of publisher Ernest M., also under counterterrorism legislation, by British police in April. Journalists will no doubt be astounded by actions of the police and rightly expect information on reasons behind Kit's detention," end quote. The statement from the National Union of Journalists has since been removed from the NUJ website, or at least the link to the statement no longer works, with no explanation as of yet as to why. A great many of Kit's stories are based on leaked documents. One of the relatively recent stories he has written is on how Anomaly 6, founded by former members of US military intelligence, is selling smartphone spyware tracking software to the US military with other potential buyers, including the UK Military of Defense and the mass surveillance agency GCHQ. Other stories Kit has written on include how UK centre-left journalist Paul Mason has sought to collaborate with elements of the British state to discredit academics, journalists, politicians, and campaigners on the left end of the political spectrum, and also how the former UK MI6 chief Richard Dearlove is part of a group of national security-linked figures who allegedly sought to orchestrate the downfall of UK Prime Minister Theresa May and elevate Boris Johnson, only for them to allegedly decide to replace Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister with then Home Secretary Priti Patel. Kit, thank you very much for joining us today on Truth Defense. Can you please unmute yourself?
Excuse me, my pleasure.
Okay, Kit, let's get straight to it. I realize you've done this a few times already, but if you could briefly describe the situation as you're leaving the plane.
Yeah, sure. So when we touched down at Luton, the pilot pretty much immediately said over the tannoy for all passengers to get their passports ready because the border control were just around the corner. Now, in all my naivety, I wondered whether Luton had been restructured since I was last there, which is well over a year now. I don't live in the UK. It's not home for me. And so I descended to the tarmac, and pretty much, right there was a team of 6 plainclothes officers checking everyone's passports. I assumed they were there for me, and lo and behold, they were. Upon ascertaining my identity, they immediately ordered me to come with them. I was taken to a back room. As you mentioned, I was provided with paperwork relating to Schedule 3 and told that I was going to be detained for the purposes of an interview, and that I faced arrest for refusing to answer questions or turning over access information to my tablet and smartphone, etc. I did not have a computer with me. And yes, I mean, straight off the bat, they were very keen to ascertain how I defined myself. Are you a journalist? Do you have any journalistic materials with you? Because, we wouldn't want to pick any of that up by accident, because they obviously subjected my devices and potentially also my bank cards and SIM cards to what are known as digital strip searches. The UK has I think the most far-reaching sweeping powers to seize and hold data in the entire world. I mean, or at least in European terms, and it goes further than the US. So, I mean, that was the general lay of the land. And then I was subject to an intensive search. My bags were gone through. I was patted down, my pockets emptied, my shoes were taken off, and my feet given a less than friendly rub to ascertain whether I had anything hidden in my socks. So yeah, I mean, it was pretty full on, pretty intense, and pretty immediate from the second we landed.
And I've noticed we can hear birds chirping. It must be quite a nice day outside for you.
Oh, yeah, it's very sunny and beautiful. Look.
And so, did you identify yourself as a journalist?
I did, yes. And then in this, there was extensive questioning about my journalistic qualifications, whether I had a press card or was a member of, press freedom, or industry bodies. And, they were also, rather curiously, very interested in what kind of rights and protections and freedoms and benefits I got or would get from being part of those organizations. So the entire focus was journalism, arguably, although this led into other matters.
Okay, so and before we go into those other matters, to be clear, not that this should matter whatsoever, but you are also a UK citizen, is that correct?
Well, I had a British passport with me, yes, and I am a British passport holder, quite legitimately, and they were rather surprised that I only had one with me, which was quite curious.
I see. So when you said it went on to other matters, can you be more specific?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, they asked me specifically about the kind of things that I work on for the Grayzone. The Grayzone was, the pretty much explicit area of focus. As you mentioned, I write for many websites. They initially expressed an interest in talking to me about them, but then they didn't even come up, and it was clear they hadn't looked into my output for these places at all. Rather ironically, after I mentioned that I wrote for Mint Press News, one of them said, "Oh, I've never heard of Mint Press Zone." They were getting it. So, but by contrast, I was explicitly told by one of the officers that they had looked into my output, and they quizzed me about a recent article I wrote about the CIA's potential recruitment of at least two 9/11 hijackers in advance of the attacks. And that led on to a discussion about my thoughts on 9/11 conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists. But yeah, as I say, the overwhelming thrust was related to allegedly hacked material that the Grayzone has received in the form of leaks, and we have reported on. There were references to Russian hacking groups that I was unfamiliar with, or had never had any knowing contact with, such as like Seaborgium, which seems to be a catch-all name for a variety of groups. And I even explicitly made the point in the interview that, well, we have not seen any forensic proof that the material we reported on is hacked. But I mean, even then, that shouldn't really matter. Like mainstream media and rights groups use allegedly or very likely hacked material all the time, and the motivation, agenda, and authenticity of the source are not questioned typically. Of the material are not questioned typically. And I specifically made the point that when you are reporting on leaked information or hacked information, its origin is not the source. The source is the material itself. And if it can be authenticated and it passes a public interest test, which we rigorously apply to all of our output at the Grayzone, then it's worth publishing. If it doesn't meet those two tests, it shouldn't be published. I mean, that's pretty standard journalism 101 ethics. And again, this in turn led into a philosophical discussion about whether my work was interesting it was in the public interest or just interesting to the public, and whether I felt I would be serving Russia's malign hostile objectives by reporting on it.
They specifically said that to you. Do you not think that you might be serving Russia's malign objectives through the reports that you've been reporting? That's something they said.
Yeah, like words to that effect. And I specifically said I didn't see how any of my work, which I might add, I've criticised Russian war crimes. I've been very critical of the war since it started. I am an anti-war, a long-standing anti-war activist. That political inclination didn't die within me just because another country's doing it, rather than my own government or the American empire of which it is a central component. But yeah, there were all sorts of questions about my thoughts on the war and whether I knew anyone Russian and whether I had any Russian friends and whether I remained in contact with current or former Russian state media contributors. The answer was by and large, no on, on all of those questions. It seemed like a grand fishing expedition, and indeed one that had been formed by, the most asinine and bizarre conspiracy theories about the Grayzone. I was asked, I was asked extensive questions about, my personal professional relationship with the Grayzone. So, how often are you paid? How much are you paid? Do you have set requirements for articles per month? What bank account are you paid in? What's the number of that bank account? But then, there were also these very bizarre queries, such as, does the Grayzone have a formal agreement with the Russian Federal Security Service to publish hacked information? I mean, I almost had to suppress a laugh at that point because it was just such a ludicrous proposition. And the fact that they apparently didn't know this and it was a subject of interest to them, I think speaks to the very paranoid, East-West Berlin mindset of the modern Western world.
That's interesting. And so they asked you specific questions about your bank details, and did you have to give that to them?
Yes, under threat of arrest.
Okay, so for viewers to be aware, the article they were referring to about 9/11, because you wrote an article, the title of which is Bombshell Filing, 9/11 Hijackers Were CIA Recruits. That was published on the 18th of April this year with the Grayzone. And it starts off, a newly released court filing raises grave questions about the relationship between Alex Station, a CIA unit set up to track al-Qaeda chief Osama bin Laden and his associates, and two 9/11 hijackers leading up to the attacks, which was the subject to a cover-up at the highest levels of the FBI. Could you very briefly just mention the core components of that piece, what was discussed in there, what was revealed, where you got the information from?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that's based on a now publicly available court filing from the Office for Military Commissions, which is the court overseeing the trial of 9/11 suspects within Guantanamo Bay. It was released in fully redacted form, apart from, rather ironically, the single word unclassified a few years back. And a website called Spy Talk somehow managed to get their hands on an unredacted copy, although it was written by a Office for Military Commissions investigator, and it is very thorough, based on review of material that's not in the public domain supplied by the Department of Defense and multiple off-record interviews with former FBI and CIA officials. It even notes that its author states that, I have not included everything that I know within this report, which, I mean, given its context, is pretty damning and explosive as it is. I mean, it kind of almost boggles the mind about what could be being held back and why. But yes, it showed that Alec Station, which was a specific component of the CIA, which, as you said, was set up to track and hunt down Osama bin Laden, appeared to be engaged in desperate covert efforts in conjunction with the Saudi's military intelligence directorate, acting as a liaison service to infiltrate Al-Qaeda and recruit assets, whether they were witting or unwitting, from his inner circle. And there were numerous FBI and CIA officials quoted in the document stating that they very much believed this was the case, and that numerous contacts between shady Saudis while the hijackers were in the US were actually done on the behest of the CIA and were planned out and carried out in conjunction with Langley. So it was pretty explosive stuff, with high-level witness after high-level witness saying, yes, we think that they had there was a dark handshake between Alex Station and two of the 9/11 hijackers.
Out of curiosity, has the reporting in mainstream or establishment press covered this at all? Have you seen that?
No.
No? Okay. So in terms of the detention that you experienced, were you charged with anything?
No. So I mean, this is like one of the various pamphlets I was given on what I was held under were rife with completely remarkable language. So one of them said, rather hearteningly, well, you are not under arrest. You are not suspected of a crime, and as such, you are not under caution. However, which is cause for celebration, one might think, but then it still states, well, however, this does not give you the rights a typical police interview would. Therefore, if you don't answer questions, you can be arrested, which is a huge corruption of the notion of the right to silence, which is or the right against self-incrimination, as it's often called, which is a very well established British legal principle dating back centuries, which has been emulated in many other countries around the world, or at least in theory. So the net was sweeping. It was extremely broad, and I had no recourse to remain silent. I could have consulted my lawyer, but I didn't, because I felt I didn't have anything to hide and I didn't want to waste their time.
Did they tell you if there is an open investigation into you, or whether or not you could expect future stops or similar treatment in the future?
I was released after 5 hours, and they said they effectively ran out of questions. I answered everything they asked me pretty comprehensively. And then they said, well, the only reason that we would keep you any longer is to continue our searches of your devices. It seems like they were going through them, photo by photo or like file by file, and it's taking an awful lot of time. So they proposed what seemed quite kind at the time. They would hold on to my camera memory cards. I'm a passionate hobby photographer, and they would return them to me after a week, which is what the law states they are obliged to do. So, I went along with this, and then the day after my interview, I was I received an email from a nameless officer who said that they would be holding my one of my seized memory cards longer than the allotted 7-day time period to typically do so, on the basis officers feel it may, quote unquote, be relevant to criminal proceedings in future, which is incredibly broad. That SD card was probably about 5-6 years old at this point. But when it got seized, it has been used in a variety of phones. I'm not entirely sure what's on them myself, apart from a lot of music, which is the only reason I brought it. So I'm not sure what, if anything, they are hoping to turn up or have turned up, and whether this can be used against me in some malign, dishonest way or other.
And did you get that SD card in the end back?
No, it's still being held.
All right. And do you know how long it will be until they return it?
No, there's no set time limit. So, I remain in limbo and, yes, under investigation.
Oh, right. So that sounds like the kind of thing that maybe you might have to pursue with a lawyer. So as we come to a close of this interview, are there any stories in particular that you've written about that you'd like people to take a look at?
Yeah, sure. So I would direct your readers to a lot of my output from Mint Press. Obviously, I'm most closely associated with Grayzone, but the Mint Press are fantastic. They're doing really great work on so many topics. I've covered new research and explosive findings in relation to MK Ultra, the CIA's mind control program. And then over at the Dissenter, which is run by our mutual friend Kevin Gostola, if that's how you actually pronounce his surname, I'm fairly sure I got that wrong. I also wrote about CIA MK Ultra related experiments in Europe, but on young children, such as like psychological warfare tests conducted on Danish orphans in the 1960s, and potential CIA links to West Germany's late Cold War paedophile scandal, in which young children were deliberately put up in the foster homes of known paedophiles in the hope that it would somehow normalize them by being in a quote unquote loving environment. So yes, I'm very proud of that, and I've also, for the Dissenter, I think this is particularly relevant in wake of my detention. I wrote a piece, I think it was in February last year, about the Defense and Security Media Advisory Committee, which is this insidious MI5, MI6, MOD initiative, which has enormous power to dictate what the British press does and doesn't report on.
Okay, fantastic. So people should, in addition to checking out Kit's work at the Grayzone, should check it out at Mint Press News and the Dissenter, where I have also published. And yes, as far as I'm aware, that is how you pronounce Kevin's last name. Yes, yeah, actually. Thank you very much, Kit, for taking the time to join us. We shall definitely be following this story as and when it develops, or as more information becomes available. Viewers can see all our past work and current work at truthdefense.org, where they can also subscribe to receive our weekly newsletter. Truth Defense is entirely funded by donations and paid subscribers. Whatever people choose to contribute will help to keep us not only going, but to expand the types of work that we can produce. These are difficult times for a great many of us, and so whatever people can contribute is greatly appreciated. Every little truly does help. Anyone who would like to contribute should go to truthdefense.org/join, where they can make a one-time donation or monthly contribution. Thank you for joining us.